Hello, everyone. Welcome to a presentation on Shakespeare's sonnets from 1609 and beyond. We are Group 1. My name is Kyrie, and I'll be your narrator for most of this presentation. Shakespeare is widely regarded as the greatest writer of the English language, and he has had massive impact on English culture, literature, and even literally the language as a whole. And so every work that Shakespeare created is studied intensely by scholars, entire fields dedicated to everything he created, everything he wrote. And so his sonnets are no exception. So this presentation will be a focus on Shakespeare's sonnets, and we're going to focus mainly on the 1609 edition. And we're going to attempt to answer the question, why is the 1609 edition so important? I think a good place to start might be to ask the question, what are Shakespeare's sonnets? Better yet, we may even ask, what is a sonnet? So a sonnet is a 14-line poem, and it usually involves themes like love, especially unrequited love. And so during Shakespeare's time, the popular form of the sonnet was the Italian sonnet or the Petrarchan sonnet. This is the sonnet that was popularized by 14th century Italian poet Francesco Petrarch. Now, in the 16th century, there was a English poet named Thomas Wyatt. He died in 1542. He is credited with introducing the sonnet into the English language. But even though he has now introduced the sonnet into English and it's in English, Thomas Wyatt still followed many of the conventions and techniques of the Petrarchan form, and therefore the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet prevailed and persisted in England until Shakespeare would arrive on the scene and write his own version of the sonnet. And so Shakespeare wrote a collection of 154 sonnets. There does seem to be, we did find in our research that there is an indication there may have been more than 154 sonnets. And the reason is, and we'll see more of this as we go on, Shakespeare never intended for these sonnets to be published. These were meant to be read by his close personal friends and acquaintances, in contrast to his plays, which were meant to be consumed by the public. But they involve themes such as love, beauty, lust, um, but the way Shakespeare approached and handled these themes were different and done in a way that hadn't been done before in the Petrarchan form. He approached these topics in a way that was much more raw, more blunt than had been done before. And so it goes into, or it leads into, why are Shakespeare's sonnets important? Well, for one thing, they provide insight into Shakespeare's thoughts and beliefs. Shakespeare is known as the greatest writer of the English language. I didn't even know this, but Shakespeare has his own title. They call him the Bard, the Bard. And even to this day, that title, the Bard, refers to Shakespeare. And so, anything or any works of his that give, a better sense of his worldview would of course be massively important. Shakespeare created a new form known as the Shakespearean sonnet. So again, uh, going from the Italian or Petrarchan form, Shakespeare's approach to the sonnet was so revolutionary, such that they named it after him, Shakespearean sonnet. They paved the way for modern romantic poetry. And so Shakespeare's sonnets are considered some of the most important poems in English. They inspired other famous poets, some that we've even talked about in this class, like John Milton. And finally, these sonnets weren't popular around the time Shakespeare wrote them, but gained mass recognition later for their brilliance. So this part's really interesting. Someone might wonder or ask the question, okay, in the modern era, Shakespeare is a legend. Uh, Everyone has probably at least heard of the name Shakespeare. How exactly does this compare to his reputation closer to his time in the 17th century? What was his reputation like back then? And so it's interesting how little information there is on this, but what we do know comes from the writings of figures that lived in the 17th century. But basically, Shakespeare was considered a talented writer, but one among many. There were other writers at the time that were held in similarly high esteem. And it's also interesting that it's flipped. When a lot of people think of Shakespeare today, a lot of people think of his plays, but in the 17th century or close to the 17th century, when his work started to be initially recognized, it was his poetry that was initially recognized because uh, they were more frequently printed than his plays. And something else to sort of think about how known he was back then. Shakespeare worked for the King's Men. This was the English playing company that ended up being officially sponsored by King James I in 1603 after he ascended to the throne. If you were an English citizen who wanted to gain admission to a Shakespeare play, it would depend on what theater the King's Men would perform at. One of the theaters they performed at was the Globe Theater. Um, but one way we can know that he was known at the time was that the Kingsmen had to put out a mandate essentially that no one could reprint Shakespeare's work because there was evidence that Shakespeare's work was being pirated, being copied. Outside the theaters that the Kingsmen would perform at, they would sometimes perform in front of the royal court, in front of English nobles, aristocrats, and elites. And so there's evidence that Shakespeare was known and held in high esteem among elites. But basically, opportunities to be exposed to Shakespeare's work was limited compared to today, where we have the internet and almost anyone can gain admission to a Shakespeare play. Shakespeare became really famous posthumously. um, Everything changed in 1623 when two of his friends at the King's Men published the first folio, which contained half of his plays. There was another edition of the folio a few years later that really catapulted Shakespeare to national recognition. John Milton wrote a poem dedicated to Shakespeare and was one of the first instances of the idea that Shakespeare was the greatest writer of the English language. And then from there, Shakespeare's reputation snowballed into the global recognition that he has today. But to steer the conversation back toward what's in scope for this presentation, no one has the original manuscripts to Shakespeare's plays. Um, so we'll see this trend continue with the sonnets. So, unlike his plays, Shakespeare's sonnets were only intended to be read by his close personal friends. They were never meant to be published for the public. No known original manuscript is extant. There's evidence from sources that they were written as early as 1598. And so this brings us to the first published edition by Thomas Thorpe in 1609, which is thought to have been derived from an earlier unfinished draft. It's thought to be unauthorized by Shakespeare for publication due to errors found in it, and there does seem to be some wonder among scholars if the unfinished draft that this edition was derived from was potentially stolen. And so in 1609, Thomas Thorpe publishes the first ever authorized edition of Shakespeare's 154 sonnets, authorized by the English government. And on May the 20th, 1609, Thorpe visits Stationers' Hall in London and receives a stationer's license, where he publishes under the title Shakespeare's Sonnets Never Before Imprinted, I believe it would be in modern English. It was printed by George Eld and sold by William Astley and John Wright, and it is currently located at the British Library in London, the shelf mark C39D35, and it is one of several copies held by the library. So here we're going to be taking a look at the first edition, and I'll be reading our group's description of it. The title page has a design of intertwined leaves in a thick line across the top, with two naked and winged cupids on either side amongst the leaves facing the center. The words Shakespeare's sonnets are under it, with a period at the end of the phrase. The word Shakespeare's is slightly larger than the word sonnets. The entire book is printed in the style of the Roman type. Underneath the title is the subtitle Never Before Imprinted, again with a period at the end of the phrase, significantly smaller font size than the title. Next are two thin horizontal lines, parallel and a half inch apart from each other. At the bottom of the page are four lines of text in a progressively smaller font. They read, "At London by George Eld for Thomas Thorpe and to be sold by William Astley, 1609." The version sold by John Wright is the same, except it has his name in place of William Astley's and includes a large black and white portrait of William Shakespeare on the page adjacent to the title page. The John Wright version also has an additional illustration before the title page of a house with a line of text explaining that it is from the margins of an ancient survey made by order of Sir George Carew. The acknowledgments page has a dedication to a MWH written by Thomas Thorpe, who addresses himself as TT. It is written in all capitals and the words are divided by periods instead of space marks. Now, one interesting thing about this acknowledgments page is scholars have not been able to figure out who this MWH is. One of the leading theories is that it could be one of Thomas Thorpe's close friends, William Home. In 1889, a man named Oscar Wilde actually wrote a fictional story dedicated to this theory in which the character kind of goes down the rabbit hole of trying to uncover who this Mr. WH is, and in this story, it actually ends up being the young boy that Shakespeare's sonnets are dedicated to. Interestingly, the page on which the sonnets begin has the title repeated. Above the title is an illustration of vines, leaves, and birds in a thick line like the illustration on the title page. The first letter of every sonnet is capitalized and twice as large as the rest of the poem's font. The words are spelled in 1600s English, so the letter V is always a U, the letter U is always a V, and the sharp S sound is often represented by a letter that looks a lot like F. The letter E is often tacked onto the end of words. Each sonnet except the first one is numbered, the number in the center above the first line of the poem. The sonnets are each one paragraph, aligned to the left. It is interesting to note that at the bottom right corner of each page, the first word of the next line is printed, though that word is repeated at the top of the next page where the poem continues. The pages are not numbered. In the version sold by William Aspley, the word Shakespeare's is at the top of every left-hand page, while Sonnets is written at the top of every right-hand page. All 154 sonnets are included. On the last page of the sonnets, we have the word finish printed in the bottom middle of the page under sonnet 154, while the letters K and A are at the bottom right corner of the page with about an inch between them. The rest of the book is a narrative poem called A Lover's Complaint. It is titled A Lover's Complaint by William Shakespeare. The format is exactly the same as the sonnets, except that it is written in unnumbered paragraphs of 7 lines. At the end of the poem, the word finish is at the bottom of the page with a black design underneath it of 4 vine squares intertwined. In the version sold by John Wright, a large black and white illustration of William Shakespeare inside a window with pen and paper in hand. Above the window stand 2 naked cupids, a crest, and a human skull. Underneath Shakespeare, some words are carved in the wall, first 2 lines of Latin words written in capital letters, and then 6 lines of cursive English that are hard to decipher, followed by 1 more line marking the date. Only 13 originals remain in the first edition from 1609. And so now we arrive at the focal point of this presentation, impact. Why is the 1609 edition important? Folger.edu states that the 1609 edition is the authoritative text, and editors usually follow it as their source. And this makes sense. It's the first ever edition. It's the first edition, first published edition. It's the root of the tree, essentially. Now, this is very important because Shakespeare didn't publish his work. Aside from his poems Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, he was involved with the publications of these 2, but aside from those 2 poems, he didn't publish his own work. He wasn't involved with the publication of his own work, nor did he give the authorization for his work to be published. He didn't think of himself as a genius, or he likely wasn't aware of the global impact he would have later. If it weren't for his friends John Heminges and Henry Condell, who published the first folio in 1623, half of his plays would have been lost forever. If it weren't for the array of other people, stationers, who saw the value in his work to get it published, no one would know about Shakespeare. And so the same concept applies to the sonnets. If it weren't for Thomas Thorpe acting on his own and publishing that 1609 edition from whatever source he got it from, we wouldn't have the sonnets today. Now, Folger.edu says 2 of the poems from the 1609 sonnets, numbers 138 and 144, were published in a 1599 collection, The Passionate Pilgrim. Some scholars even saying these were different than the ones that appeared in the 1609 edition, these being closer to the Shakespeare's manuscripts, but just for those 2. And those are only 2 poems out of the 154 that we got in 1609. So if we were to subtract Thomas Thorpe, his edition, we'd have 2 poems, sonnets 138 and 144, and just mere references to the sonnets in general in Francis Mary's 1598 book. And so now we get to our thesis statement for this entire presentation. Without Thomas Thorpe, no one would know about Shakespeare's sonnets. If you like time travel, if you like DC's Flash or Doctor Who or Into the Spider-Verse, this is a canon event. It's a canon event. You change one seemingly minor thing about the past and it creates an entirely different reality, often unrecognizable from what came before. And so if Thomas Thorpe never published his 1609 edition, we now do not have a Shakespearean sonnet. And so the Petrarchan form will return to prominence. But that is now the premier form that all the poets are going to be using. So that lineage of writers that were inspired by the Shakespearean sonnet, that gets weakened or in some parts erased entirely. John Milton, who wrote a dedicatory poem to Shakespeare as the greatest writer of the English language, that gets snuffed out. Um, and so these names, John Milton, William Wordsworth, these guys, great writers, they're now at the forefront of this part of poetry, and they're great writers, but you're taking away the tradition that they credit with inspiring them to become their best. And so this will result in less eloquent poetry. And Shakespeare's reputation is weakened. He still likely would have been famous because of his plays being published, but his ability as a poet wouldn't be as well known, and that would affect his reputation as the greatest writer of the English language. We also have no riz, no riz, no shall I compare thee to a summer's day. All of the iconic lines that have come out of Shakespeare's sonnets, those get wiped out. Um, this entire scholarly fields dedicated to the study of Shakespeare's sonnets and everything we know about Shakespeare. There's scholars studying it. Those would get wiped out as it relates to the sonnets. Um, any artwork, any films, any novels, anything that was inspired directly from the sonnets, those get wiped out. We also understand Shakespeare less because one of the things about the sonnets was that we get Shakespeare's inner voice, his views on love and the world. Those get wiped out. We don't know that about Shakespeare anymore. And so these are massive repercussions. It's a very nasty domino effect that you know completely alters the English language and the English culture. English becomes less eloquent. And so framing it in these terms, I really think best illustrates why this edition is so important. So when it comes to other editions, there have been thousands of publications containing Shakespeare sonnets. And so the wording here is important because so the 1609 edition is the authoritative edition. It's the root of the tree essentially, because Shakespeare never published his manuscripts. This was the only person that got closest to doing that, and so a lot of the publications contain much of Shakespeare's other works, but they usually don't have the full 154 sonnets. So the Passion Pilgrim third edition, this was the same publication that had those two sonnets from before 138 and 144 before the 1609 edition. So they released the third edition of that in 1612, but it still only had those two sonnets, just 138 and 144. They didn't have the full 154. Um, Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, History, and Tragedies. This was out of the first folio where a lot of Shakespeare's plays were published, and that's, a huge reason as to how he became famous. But it only contained A Lover's Complaint, just that one sonnet um, from the 1609 edition, and that was at the end of it, at the end of the first folio. We have Sonnets, second edition, published in 1640. This was the first major edition or publication after the 1609 to have most of the sonnets. I believe they had 146 of them. Only 146 of the sonnets appeared in that edition. And then for some of the modern editions, the first folio of Shakespeare in 1991. We have the Oxford Shakespeare, the complete sonnets and poems in 2008, and then all the sonnets of Shakespeare in 2020. So the first, the best, and worst. So when it comes to these editions, the first one, obviously, Shakespeare's Sonnets Never Before Imprinted, published in 1609 by Thomas Thorpe. This is considered the authoritative source for Shakespeare's sonnets. I mean, it's the closest anyone has ever gotten and will ever get to Shakespeare's manuscripts for the sonnets. I've been calling it the root of the tree. Every edition that has come after that edition is based on the 1609 version. And so when it comes to best and worst of these editions, this seems to be referring to more in a scholarly sense. You know, adding additional things like stage directions and commentary, interpreting what Shakespeare was talking about in his original sonnets and converting these into a modern format with modern spellings, modern English conventions. And so, of these in this arena, it seems the Art and Shakespeare third series is largely considered to be the best, the most scholarly of the modern editions. And so the Art in Shakespeare is a collection of Shakespeare's works. Like, so again, this is like a publication of all of Shakespeare's works. It's not entirely dedicated to the sonnets, but this has been a series that has been running for over 100 years. They had multiple series. So their third series was started to be published in 1995. They concluded publishing in 2020, published by this company, Bloomsbury Publishing. They're going to be releasing the fourth series sometime in 2026. But this is the modern scholarly edition that's held in the highest esteem and is most widely used from our research. When it comes to the worst of these editions, none seem to be as bad as John Benson's poems written by William Shakespeare in 1640. So apparently, Benson saw that the sonnets were selling well, and there wasn't a high level of interest in them. And so, in order to, uh, increase interest and be able to sell more, he tried, making changes but really ended up turning it into something of his own. He reorganized them, made all these changes essentially that deviated from the 1609 version. One of them, the most controversial, being the changing of the pronouns from male to female, because the first 126 of the sonnets were to a male lover. A homosexual relationship was controversial at the time, so he changed those pronouns from male to female to make it seem like they were written to a female lover. And so this deviation, this alteration from the original is what really uh, made it infamous as the worst of the editions or publications related to Shakespeare's sonnets. All right, guys, so that's it for me. I will now be turning the presentation over to our wonderful Kaylee, and she will be sharing with you guys our group's take on a modern 2025 edition of Shakespeare's sonnets, and also going through the rationale behind our group's design.
Hello, my name is Kaylee, and I will be taking over the voiceover for just a little bit to talk about our rationale and our mock-up for our 2025 edition of Shakespeare's Sonnets. The main goal of our mock-up and everything was to be an updated version of Shakespeare's sonnets, intended to be available for college students taking some kind of British literature class. Our main goal in creating this 2025 edition is to create a text that is both educational, accurate, and easy to read for undergraduate college students. Our edition, unlike some of the other editions of Shakespeare's sonnets, only contains works by Shakespeare. Many others include poems and things written by other authors, and we chose not to include those for the sake of purely focusing on Shakespeare's works. We chose to use Times New Roman 12-point font because it's a more sophisticated or professional font that is easy to read. And we also chose to use 2 columns on most of the pages of the mock-up, especially for the table of contents and things like that, in order to preserve space on the page and reduce the overall number of pages. So going through the mock-up a little bit, it starts out with the title, The Shakespeare Sonnets, Never Before Printed by William Shakespeare, and of course a photo of Shakespeare himself. It also has the credits for the 2025 edition, the names of all of our group members. That is followed by the table of contents, like I mentioned, is in 2 columns in order to preserve space, and this includes all of the sonnets from 1 through 54, all followed by the first line of the sonnet in order to make them more identifiable. This is followed by a dedication to Shakespeare that was written by Thomas Thorpe, and following that is an example sonnet. We chose Sonnet 10. On one side, we have the original 1609 Shakespeare's words, and next to it, we have the updated 2025 version that is in a more modern, easier to understand word choice. We chose to keep the original alongside the updated version, so there could be comparisons, and it would be nice to have both for college students, whether they're working on projects that require the original text or it's easier for comprehension in a more modern language. Following that, we have a sample page of the apparatus, which just includes a quick note to the reader and, of course, the glossary that includes any information that may be needed. And following that to end is all additional resources. And this is essentially a version of just source citation, all the sources that we use to create this 2025 mock-up and everything else. But yes, that is essentially a little overlook at our rationale and mock-up.